Today's lesson is Lesson 3, The Birthplace of the Revolution. Our story today unfolds in the city of Boston, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was in many ways the heart of the British colonies. A large population, vibrant seaport, and healthy economy combined to create a thriving community of colonists. The people of Boston were particularly committed to the freedoms they associated with colonial life and, as you will see, were willing to go to extreme measures to hold on to their liberty. Not surprisingly, Boston became the heart of the resistance towards the British as well. It was during the late 1760s and the early 1770s that the smoldering embers of the Revolution were fanned into a flame. A group of colonists who were increasingly unified, more taxes enacted by the British, and violent clashes in the city of Boston all brought the British and their American colonies even closer to war. Let's take a look at how the stage was set for a change. The Stamp Act had come and gone, but remember, Britain was still in dire need of money. In 1767, the Townshend Acts, named for Charles Townshend, who was now in charge of revenue and taxes in the British Parliament, proposed a whole slew of new taxes on imports to the colonies from England: paper, paint, glass, lead, tea, and British china. Townshend thought the tax on imports, an external tax, would be more readily accepted, but instead it was met with much anger by the colonists. From what you've learned, it is easy to believe that Townshend was surprised by the colonists' reaction. You may be as surprised as Townshend was when his taxes were met with a boycott of British imports, beginning, of course, in Boston. Merchants worked hard to organize and implement the non-importation agreement and ultimately to convince other colonies to join with them. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The colonists began to work together more efficiently and became more organized. They used strategies like this boycott and formed groups that met regularly with specific ideas about how the colonies should react to British offenses. One group was the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. Have you ever heard of them? The name of the group comes from a speech that was given after the infamous Stamp Act. This group had the same goal as the average colonist: to unite the colonies and stand up to British control. The way they wanted to do this, however, was quite different. Remember the story of Andrew Oliver, the tax collector in Boston, who was threatened and harassed in response to the Stamp Act? The Sons of Liberty were the catalyst for this event and many more like it. They were some of the most extreme resistors of British power in the colonies. This group was radical and determined to do whatever was necessary to defend their freedoms. It started in 1765 in the hotbed of insurrection. Boston as a secret club of 9 men, but grew quickly to include chapters throughout the 13 colonies. While their ideals and dedication was admirable, they often resorted to intimidation and violence to get their point across. The Daughters of Liberty came about as an offshoot of their male counterparts, also dedicated to freedom and unity. During the boycott, patriots were expected to buy only American-made goods. This made life rather difficult for the colonists because they depended on many imported products for daily life. Much of the fabric came from England, so the daughters decided to host spinning bees in their community. By hosting gatherings where women would spin and weave fabric for long hours, they were able to make enough to cover their fabric needs without relying on imports. They also swore off tea and other British goods. These determined women will appear again in our story, so keep your ears open for other creative ways they joined this cause. The Sons of Liberty often met secretly after nightfall in Boston at an old tree that became known as the Liberty Tree. Imagine, under the cover of darkness, a collection of men huddled beneath moonlight branches, plotting their next strike against the British. This tree was also where Andrew Oliver's effigy was hung, along with many others over the years. The Liberty Tree was planted on the road headed out of Boston in 1646, and it came to represent freedom and revolt in the years leading up to the American independence. So much so that other colonies even designated their own Liberty Trees. It was a gathering place and a powerful symbol of unity until 1775, when British troops, realizing the significance it held for the colonists, chopped it down. You should know that Thomas Paine is sometimes referred to as the father of the Revolution. He wrote a small book or pamphlet called Common Sense. In it, he detailed the reasons why the colonies should separate from Britain. In many ways, it continued to fan the flame of independence. See if you can find a copy online and read the reasons Paine listed for separation. The Boston Massacre, 1770. Tensions surrounding new taxes and colonial retaliation had been brewing long before this, and conflicts between British soldiers and angry colonists were nothing new in Boston. The two groups resisted one another, and clashes between the two groups due to their different ideologies were common. One night in March of 1770, a confrontation arose outside the barracks of the British Army. An unruly mob of colonists taunted and challenged 7 soldiers who had come to aid of a single guard who had been targeted. There are varying reports of what happened next. The soldiers were surrounded by the crowd, who were throwing ice and snow at them, taunting them to shoot, knowing they hadn't been given orders to fire their weapons. One of the British suddenly fired his musket, possibly by accident, possibly because he was jostled, or perhaps just out of fear. Accounts are unclear. Upon hearing the shot, the other soldiers fired as well, assuming they had received permission to fire. They wounded 8 colonists. 3 died immediately, and 2 died later of their injuries. Three died immediately, and 2 died later of their injuries. The following day, radical colonists described the event as a large-scale massacre. In reality, it was more a massacre of misunderstanding. There are always 2 sides to every story. Let's take a few minutes to discuss an important element of the history: propaganda. This was for older students, but I'm going to include it. In simple terms, propaganda is when someone presents their opinion as fact or misleads others to try to convince or sway people. This is actually quite common, and propaganda has been used throughout history. This picture is an example of propaganda. Radical colonists used it to convince conservatives to join them in their outcry against the British. They painted the British as merciless killers, when in the truth they were likely acting out of fear for their own lives in what must have been a scary situation. We have to be careful to consider that there is often bias in a single viewpoint. We should instead consider all perspectives. The Tea Act of 1773. In a twist of irony, Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts except for the tax on tea, on the very same day that the Boston Massacre occurred. You might think that canceling these taxes would have the colonists celebrating, but it wasn't that simple. Parliament kept the tax on tea to remind the colonies of its right to impose control in any way it chose fit. As you can probably guess, this did not go well. A few days later, in 1773, Parliament passed a new act aiming at bailing out the British East India Company, a British-owned company that traded in Asia. It was called the Tea Act. They had a plethora of tea to sell, so the English decided to sell it in the colonies at a reduced price, tax-free. On the surface, this may have seemed like a favor, but in reality it cut the colonial merchants out of the deal because they couldn't sell their tea at a price that low. It was another example of Parliament deciding the colonies' business for them. The Boston Tea Party. When British ships brought this tea into the Boston harbor, a plan was made to let Parliament know in no uncertain terms how many of the colonists felt about the interference. Few things are as representative of the clash between the British and their colonies as the Boston Tea Party. As the saying goes, it really was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because their livelihood was threatened, normally obedient colonists joined forces with the Sons of Liberty to protest in a way that would get some attention. Let's take a look at some of the details of this infamous act. Whipped into a frenzy by Samuel Adams, one of the most vocal Sons of Liberty, a crowd of about 60 men boarded ships bearing the ill-fated tea in Boston Harbor on the night of December 16, 1773. The colonists who participated in the Boston Tea Party dressed up as Indians, people in blankets and headdresses during the events, both as an attempt to disguise their identity, but also as a symbol of freedom and independence that colonists wanted to show while sending the message that they were separate from Britain. They dumped 342 crates of tea into the harbor, over 90,000 pounds, or 45 tons, of tea. The value of that amount of tea today is roughly $1 million. The term tea party actually referred to the group of people who threw the tea overboard, not a tea party like we think of today. The Intolerable Acts of 1774. Now the gloves were off between England and the American colonies. Imagine how angry the British government must have been at the blatant act of rebellion. They came up with a plan they believed would scare the subversive colonists into obedience. Instead, it backfired and actually further unified the colonists. Parliament brought down harsh punishment in the form of the coercive acts, known to the colonists as simply the Intolerable Acts. There were 5 of them in all, but 3 deserve a closer look as they had a serious impact on the daily lives of Bostonians. Number 1. First, Parliament closed the port of Boston to all trade until the tea that was ruined during the Boston Tea Party was paid off. This had a major impact on the economy of the city and the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony. Number 2, another act reorganized the colonial government by replacing their local elected officials with leaders appointed by the English, the ultimate offense to the self-sufficient colonists. Number 3, the third act was for all the colonies. Colonial governments were forced to house and feed British soldiers in barracks provided by the colonies at their own expense. If barracks were unavailable, local inns or stables were to be used. Both the English and their colonies were pushed to the breaking point. Neither was willing to compromise, and as we have seen in the events that took place, the enmity between them was growing even stronger. Boston became known as the birthplace of the American Revolution because of the iconic location like the Liberty Tree, its connection to groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and events such as the Boston Massacre and Tea Party. We haven't heard the last of it. And this concludes, I think, Lesson 3 for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it.